Hello, good afternoon. This is Claudia from Marcus Evans, and thank you so much for joining us today's event on the roadmap to virtual engagement in clinical operations, brought to you in partnership with Think3. Before I begin, I just want to cover a few housekeeping items. As you can see, there is a bunch of widgets in the bottom of your screen that you can use during today's events. You have access to a Q&A widget, which is what you're going to be using to submit any questions during the event. We also have added a team chat or kind of an attendee chat, which we will have our team in the back end commenting about today's event. So any comments that you want to share with your colleagues today, please feel free to do so in that attendee chat. We also added additional resource and materials, which are available to you on the resource link. So feel free to go to that widget, download, and click in any resource that you may find useful. We would like to continue hearing from you, so therefore we have added as well a meeting option. So any times that you would like to meet up and perhaps arrange a quick call, 10 to 15 minutes with someone specialist on the Think3 team, please feel free to click on and book that meetings. I believe that will take you straight away into one of the specialists' schedule, and they will be more than happy to continue the conversation on today's topic on site. Now, there is also available to you a copy of today's slide deck and some additional materials. So I just wanted to let you know that all that is on the resource list. So again, make sure that you go into that resource list and download anything that you find useful. And for the best viewing experience, we recommend you using a wide internet connection and closing all the sessions running in the back end, so that way you can clearly concentrate on today's discussion. We have a great panel, and I hope that you learned from all of them. A quick reminder, we also have some polls on today's discussions. It's really important for us to know what you're thinking, so we can comment on that, and we will be sharing your thoughts during today's panel. So please, every time that we send our poll, make sure that you hit the answer, and we will review it with our experts during today's discussion. So I don't think that I have left anything else on your end, but again, any questions, any help that you need, feel free to either reach out to me via the Q&A widget, or perhaps if you want to further explore any other materials, hit that help widget at the bottom of the screen, and you will find many answers if you're facing any kind of connectivity issues. So without any further delays, let's get started. I'm going to hand it over to Lens, who is your panel moderator today, and he's going to take it off from here. Lens, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Claudia. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event. Before we get into introductions, I just wanted to start off with a quick poll. So the topic today is virtual engagement. We're curious as to how the pandemic changed your virtual collaboration strategy over the past year or so. And while folks are answering that question, we'll go ahead and introduce the all-star lineup we have today. So I will start with myself. I'm Lance Hill. I'm the CEO and founder of Within3. So I've been focused on solving communication challenges virtually in the life sciences market for 15 plus years. Before that, I started my career at IBM and other Fortune 500 communications and technology organizations over time. So thrilled to be here, and hopefully I'll do two things today, is just provide a baseline for some of the virtual technology that exists in the market, and then facilitate really Q&A with the panel that we have. So with that, I will introduce the folks, maybe starting with Cornelius.
Yeah, hi. My name is Cornelius Winnips. I work at Novartis headquarters in Basel, Switzerland. And there I am responsible for running clinical trials in mostly remote areas in Africa, Asia, Latin America, in tropical disease. And so we have in my role, I have a lot of dealings with operational issues and also a lot of experience since about a year with performing a lot of these things virtual. So happy to share that with you, and look forward to a very interactive meeting today.
Perfect. Dr. Om Sharma.
Yeah, I'm Om Sharma, and I have my background is I was professor for 14 years teaching in medical schools, endocrinology, and urology and OBGYN. Then for last 30 years, I've been in pharma industry, mainly in clinical development. So I've gone through from beginning to filing NDAs and approvals. And currently I'm working at Daiichi Sankyo as a senior director of clinical development, global oncology R&D, and working on mainly on ADC compounds, which are very, very important or sort of new class of drugs for the solid tumor. We are working in another heme also, but my group has been mainly in solid tumor. Thank you.
Okay, Blake Morrison.
Yes, good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, wherever you all are. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Blake Morrison. I'm the Vice President of Global Medical Affairs at Turning Point Therapeutics. We're a company, small biotech headquartered in San Diego, California, and I'm presently sitting in my office in the San Francisco Bay Area. My responsibilities at Turning Point include evidence generation for medical affairs-led studies, and looking forward to the conversation and how virtual engagements has been able to kind of carry us over through a difficult time with the pandemic.
And last but not least, Dr. Nisha Kathari.
Thanks, Lance. Yeah, so I'm Nisha Kathari. I'm a medical oncologist by training. I've worked in oncology R&D for the last 4 years, and I've worked within 3 platform for about the last year, primarily with steering committee meetings and protocol training sessions. So looking forward to the discussion today. Thanks.
Okay, great. So let's take a look at the results of the poll question. Wow, so more than half a total pivot. That's obviously a big change. And I think what's interesting, we'll talk about in the panel today, is kind of what that portends for the future, and even envisioning a post-pandemic world. But I think clearly it's the pandemic has changed all of our timing in terms of looking at how to use virtual, when to use virtual, what is virtual, and all those things hopefully we'll cover here today. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and give you a very fast overview of the landscape on the technology side before kind of getting into the panel discussion. So that way we're all talking from the same overall base of knowledge. So just quickly, for those who don't know, if you're not familiar with Within3, which is our company, we are a company that looks for places in life sciences where communication is hard, difficult, redundant, expensive, time-consuming, and we build technology solutions to solve those. We've been doing that for a number of years. We work with all 20, the top 20 life science companies around the world. Our platform supports 100 different languages. We deliver services in 15 different languages in all parts of the globe, all the way down to the smallest of biotechs. We also do a lot in med device and kind of related life science industries outside of pharma directly. And so we'll be bringing some of that experience to the table today. So when we talk about virtual engagement, what we're really talking about is engaging groups of stakeholders along the process of the life cycle. And there's really a couple of ways to do that. There's real-time engagement and asynchronous engagement or overtime engagement. And so real-time meetings, I think at this point, we are all so familiar with, whether they are kind of the Zoom, WebEx, Brady Bunch sort of ad hoc meetings, or more formal presentations like On24, like we're using right now. But these are meetings where everyone's online at the same place at the same time, hopefully on video camera. And these meetings have kind of pros and cons as it pertains to communication. So if what you're looking for is a lot of back and forth dialogue, you want everyone to participate fully. Because everyone has to be at the same place and the same time, the more people you get on the phone, the more we're in a situation like we are now, where a few of us will be speaking and most people will not. But these are incredibly good for nonverbal communication, back and forth, spontaneous communication. They're a bit easier to kind of schedule logistically than kind of the live meetings of the past. And I think at this point, everyone's been living these technologies. The webinar technologies are more for larger groups like we're doing right now. They have more controls over who can log in and who can't, who can talk and who can't, and those sorts of things. So these sorts of technologies really best mimic kind of a short live meeting and kind of how they're set up. And everyone's typically very familiar with these, and most companies have a standard technology or technologies that they're using for these. And then the other kind of meeting is an overtime virtual meeting. So this is more like the online university model, where instead of saying we're going to have everyone log in for an hour today for this call, instead what we'll do is we'll have a meeting that's happening online over a couple of days or a couple of weeks, where people can log in as they want to or need to in that time frame, interact with materials, answer questions, and so forth. So that's called an overtime meeting or an asynchronous meeting. Our platform does that. We're one of the players in that space as well. And just for those who aren't familiar with those sorts of technologies, because those are often the newer things that people get exposed to, and just at a very high level. So conversations unfold on these sorts of platforms over time. So people are logging in, they're reviewing materials, they're talking to each other, they're tagging each other. There's moderators orchestrating the conversation, asking for follow-up and that sort of thing. And they allow for both qualitative and quantitative sorts of interactions. So, you can be asking questions around, what are the best criteria for selecting trial sites, and have that be quantitative, and then ask people why that is, and have that be qualitative. And this can be done with patients, payers, all the stakeholders kind of along the way. These sorts of tools typically have a good way to kind of look at documents. So in a WebEx or a Zoom or a real-time sort of meeting, you can kind of like whiteboard over a document that's on the screen during the meeting. These sorts of tools have a lot more robust function for actually having long, detailed discussions in and around specific sets of documents. These tools also have co-authoring sorts of capabilities. So if you're building out protocols with groups, you can do that with full tracking and compliance and discussion and back and forth and looking at data and all those sorts of things. These tools typically have language translation as well. So you're not relying on everyone kind of speaking the same language at the same time, at the same accent. They'll translate them uniformly. They also have speech recognition, so that you're not, so people can be basically dictating and talking into these tools and have that all come up onto the screen as well, very similar to how physicians will dictate into medical records. And all the output from an overtime meeting is consolidated into some sort of structured document that you can use. So pros and cons are a bit different when you're talking about 5 participants or more. So when you're talking about a larger audience, the video conference solutions are really good for presenting to a larger audience, having a few people talk and most people kind of listen like we're doing right now. They're also very spontaneous, so they're good for kind of what's your reaction to this off the top of your head. For larger groups, the asynchronous sorts of platforms are good when you're not so much presenting data per se, but you're looking for everyone to give thoughts, participate, have time to kind of understand and see their answers. And finally, the secret sauce is people do both interchangeably, and that's really how they should be done. So depending on what you're doing, one or both sorts of approaches will work. And then finally, before we get to the panel, these sorts of virtual technologies are being used all across the life cycle within R&D for all sorts of purposes, from insight gathering to training to investigator meetings to the various sorts of review committees and boards that happen. And so they really have permeated any place there's discussion. They've permeated the environment as an alternative method to maybe the traditional live meeting. So that is my very, very rapid overview. And now I know the panel has different folks in the panel have different experiences, both with the real-time and/or the overtime sorts of virtual engagement within their purview, and that's what we will be talking about today. So I'm going to start with the panel, but while I do that, we'll start off with a poll question that folks can answer, and then we'll start the panel discussion, then come back to this. So how were your teams collaborating over the last year? These sorts of tools that we talked about, the live webinar meetings like we're having right now, primarily kind of email and intranet, which is another kind of form of an overtime sort of discussion, if you think about it, or an overtime asynchronous platform like Within 3, or maybe internally on Microsoft Teams, or other sorts of collaboration platforms that take place kind of over time. So while folks are starting there, let me kick off with the panel, and I'm going to start off maybe with Dr. Winnips. Maybe you can start off and say how can maybe the last 12 months, virtual engagement in your world, what has been the impact, and how has it improved, if at all, what you do? Nope. Cornelius, are you there? He might be frozen, so I am going to turn that communication and maybe Blake over to you.
So 2020 was, of course, a very tough year, and in the context of it, I switched roles and companies along the way. So initially, with the emergence of the pandemic, we went to a full live webinar type of approach versus the usual travel. And we were in the process of developing a protocol for a new diagnostic test that we were working on. And the company that we were collaborating with there were a couple of companies and they were dispersed. So really, it changed the whole landscape, and we started doing a lot of the work through live webinars, and as you mentioned before, Lance, marking up documents, in these kinds of settings and whatnot. We did not initially use the overtime asynchronous approach. We were using conventional email. And the challenges we had with that, as I think everybody can appreciate, is everybody's immersed with lots of email. They lose them, they misplace them, misfile them, and whatnot. So there was quite a bit of kind of a learning curve of how to work on intricate documents and protocols and things like that in a matter where we were trying to do it apart from one another in those settings. And so it challenged the organization. About midway through, then we switched over, and I switched into another company where now I'm at Turning Point and really working on this whole evidence generation. And the live webinar plus the asynchronous meetings have really been a benefit in terms of being able to kick off a conversation about a particular strategy or whatever the case is, and then carry that forward through the asynchronous approach, which is much more fruitful, much more organized, and you don't lose stuff as easily as you do with, I'd say, conventional email and things like that. Plus, I think it's more secure, so it's been a benefit for us.
Nishi, how about your company?
Yeah, so interestingly, my company that I've been working at for the last year or so was actually very remote friendly, and folks were really all over the world already. So there wasn't too much of a change with COVID. It was really just the same email and webinar platform. And I actually had some trouble convincing folks that, hey, we should use a platform like Within 3, especially with our external partners, because folks were already so comfortable using the webinar tools. And they initially, I don't think, saw the value in doing something asynchronously like this. So that was actually a little bit of a struggle for me in terms of culture change within the organization that already thought that they were very remote friendly.
And how about your company? How was the last 12 months? How has virtual affected your company over that time?
Yes, there have been quite a bit changes. To begin with, being international or global organization, and particularly being Japanese company, and we all sitting here in the U.S., we had certain amount of those capabilities pre-existing. However, not to the extent what we have now. And so over the time, one thing is like you can have emails and you can have those global meetings, but that's not the same thing when you can have virtually really have these interactive meetings. So like webinars and those things change now. We lately using MS meetings, which is a relatively much better sort of tool. And it has its own pluses and minuses. So plus on the plus side, I would say it is much more interactive in the sense of like we are sort of like sitting next to each other. And versus when you are in those webinar type meeting and someone is presenting and and you are listening, here you can also interact. So people can actively really participate and everybody. I feel like there is a more inclusive participation through this virtual system, what we are using now versus what we were doing a year ago. And also we know for sure that even for the, let's say, US group, we are not in office for the last 20 years. So even from that point of view, it's we sometimes when you need something, you evolve into that. And so need of this pandemic has evolved into the system where we can efficiently, effectively communicate with each other. And this is I'm talking about the interaction within the organization. But for us, working with the sites, investigators, our KOLs, as well as even presenting in the scientific meetings. Without these tools, it would not have been the same thing. So in a way, as I was talking about pluses and minuses, the plus side is it is much more interactive. It has been really, I would say, quite efficient efforts using these tools. And yeah, there is negative side. It's that you don't have human interaction in the sense of face-to-face interactions. But still, I think we have done very well in this using virtual system. I can give on later on certain specific examples and where we have plus side of the virtual world.
So I think we have Cornelius back online. You know, it's interesting, back to the pros and cons. One of the cons of a real-time meeting is if something goes wrong in real time, it goes wrong in real time, and technology is technology, and sometimes that happens. But Cornelius, maybe you could talk about on your side how these virtual technologies have impacted what you do over the last year or so.
Yeah. And it's been quite an impact, right? So as I mentioned in the introduction, in my role, I'm overseeing a number of trial programs in different parts of the world. We traditionally used to run these trials a lot with face-to-face contacts, starting with investigator meetings, also monitoring visits, live meetings with the Safety Monitoring Board, training meetings, which were always, I would say, logistically quite challenging and took a lot of time, money, and energy to get organized. We experienced, of course, since about a year, a problem with doing these meetings, and we were forced to go completely virtual from one moment to the next. And I must say it's been a positive experience. We have been working with different tools and providers and systems to organize a lot of the meetings around the studies virtual. We ran, I think in this time frame, about 10 investigator meetings, which were large meetings with over 150 participants per meeting. We ran a number of training meetings around our trials where we had all the CRAs, the local assisting staff on calls. And we were positively surprised by the efficiency and the ease to set things up. Even though we work in very remote places, we work in Africa, sometimes in Asia, we hardly suffered from connectivity issues, and this was quite remarkable. So overall, it's been a very good experience, and I believe this will be a lasting experience. Of course, it does not fully replace the face-to-face contacts, but it will certainly find a place, and I think we'll in future look more towards a hybrid way of working. Mm-hmm. And it has been, I would say, a positive side effect of this whole Corona crisis.
So clearly, the benefits of being face-to-face and being able to meet people, interact with people, and shake hands and all of that is tremendously important. But I think on the flip side of that, I think a couple of you have mentioned that the outcomes were different with virtual, and in some ways, in certain scenarios, better. I'd like to maybe double click on that and see what are the places where virtual works better outside of maybe the obvious of the coordination and logistics, but are the outcomes of the actual activities you're trying to do materially improved by virtual, or on the flip side, maybe there are places where you think they're really much worse. Maybe I'll start with Nishi.
Yeah, so I definitely had the experience of running steering committee meetings for a particular trial prior to COVID and then during COVID as well. And I actually found that my outcomes were better if we're going to judge outcomes based on the quality of the material I got out of the meetings. When you're in a room, sometimes with 8 or 10 physicians, all of whom have very strong personalities, people are kind of talking over each other, and you'll miss maybe a quieter physician or somebody who doesn't feel quite as confident. So we found that we were actually, with the asynchronous portion of the meeting, getting much more nuanced and I think diversity of viewpoints that we were really not getting when we were all in a room together. So to me, I would really continue that even when we do have the option of being face-to-face, because I think there is value. And I think Cornelius mentioned a hybrid approach of perhaps doing some pre-work ahead of time where you're getting all of those opinions, and then you can really moderate effectively if you do get to be in person.
Mm-hmm. And Blake, how about you? So you're deploying kind of both strategies at the same time. It sounds like in your programs, what kind of difference in outcomes, pro and con, are you seeing?
I would agree with what the previous speaker just said, is that it has improved, but there is an adjustment period. And importantly, especially with the asynchronous part, it's not you build it and they will come approach. It really is something that has to be nurtured and moderated. And I can't emphasize that enough. If you open up a window and you throw some content out there or throw a few questions out there and expect people to kind of jump in and do it, at least in my experience, it hasn't been quite that straightforward. You do really have to have strong oversight and moderation for the membership that's you're seeking the input from, so that it continues to kind of stimulate them and keep them on task. But I think if with that proper moderation, you really can enrich the overall experience. That being said, the live in person still has a major place in I think our industry and our roles, and of course the replacement of live webinars to get that initial kind of gut reaction to some of the things that you're asking about. But the asynchronous really smooths that out over time, where you start getting more thoughtful and insightful kind of responses versus a reactionary response. And I think the blending of those two are quite rich.
So how about you? Are there places where you've seen better outcomes and places where you've seen worse outcomes with virtual?
So to begin with, I agree with Nishi and Blake, what they both of them said quite eloquently. I would give a few examples of how it has helped in a positive way, and I will also talk about the negative way. So the positive way is, like, for example, we had, and there are various activities there. Activities are ongoing as usual, basically, I would say. So investigators meeting. Investigators meetings have been relatively, I would say, on the successful side, because, when you have investigators meeting, it's always an issue of time, scheduling, because all physicians are busy in different parts of the world and different timings and all that. So this has made somewhat life easier. The other part is we could invite in the face-to-face investigators meeting, physical meetings, one investigator and a coordinator, or maybe sub-PI. And in these meetings, if there are more than 2 or 3 people from the site, they could join that. Of course, we have to plan a size, also reasonable size. But that gave an opportunity that when you are doing, let's say, you're teaching the site for your protocol particularly, then you have people, all the relevant people there, so they don't have to hear it from secondary, from the PI or from notes or slides. They are then there. The other advantage is when we are conducting these investigators trials, of course we always have to record that, but these are already are recorded automatically. Basically, you're recording them. So when we want to put that in the requirements, SOP requirements for certain people who are at the study site, they can watch the video, can go through the training, and they can get sort of their approval for that they have gone through the training. And of course, the other side is it saves some cost also, because it's eventually industry cost to invite investigators and running these and places and housing and travel and all that. So that part has become kind of, so this is the positive side. The negative side is always you don't have physical interaction with people. However, I turn it into the positive, because in the pandemic situation, probably this is a blessing in disguise, because if we had to meet, let's say, physically, even if it reduces the number of people and distance, then there is always a chance of risk traveling, this and that. So that I turn that into a positive thing, that it's a good thing that we have technology which does not have so much of impact on the efficiency of delivering message or interaction or learning. So this is the negative side of this thing. And there are other examples. For example, we have to have SDV on the site physically, and there are certain, every site they have somewhat different rules, and they will have problem on scheduling, they will have problem on accommodating our CRAs, and in this situation, of course, they have to go through the changes of rules and regulations, but it became sort of easier to conduct those SDVs on study sites. Of course, we had a lot of problems in the changing their institutional rules and having those deviations and accepting those by video conferences, because that's normally not done this way in the past and before pandemic. So that is kind of positive side of it.
Yeah, Cornelius, what's your reaction to what Om said? How has virtual helped or hurt your world in the last 12 months?
Yeah, I was actually going to make similar comments than to Om, right? I think the virtual, in my opinion, works really well for larger meetings where you have kind of an educational or goal, like a training meeting or an investigator meeting. Where I think it's certainly not optimal is, and that was just mentioned by Om as well, is when you really deal with a site, in our case, a clinical site where you need to go for monitoring, for checking the site, for site initiation visits. It can be done virtual, but it is a compromise, right? We only do that when there is no other option. And it does miss out on a lot of things. There is always, the devil is always in the detail. Virtual, you cannot really check, how, for example, medication is stored and handed out. You have a much less overview of how the site manages the documentation, how they physically operate, who sits where, who sees the patients, who does the administrative task. This is really challenging when you do it virtual. And we do it, but it is a compromise. And I'm sure that as soon as we have the freedom again to travel and visit sites, we will, do these kind of monitoring visits, initiation visits, fully in person again. So there I see some, let's say, challenges. But for the larger meetings, yes, virtual will, remain and remain a very important channel. I think we have, surprisingly, as I said before, very positive experience.
So Nishi, what about the stakeholders that we deal with? What is their reaction then? Healthcare professionals, KOLs, et cetera, kind of along the continuum with now having to engage with industry in these virtual formats?
So honestly, I think it's been mixed in my experience. So some folks kind of jump right in and they really like it. They're so excited, to be part of this. And some folks are saying, what, one more platform? Like, I don't want to learn how to do yet another thing. So I think, especially in the physician community, you have to be like willing and able to kind of walk some of them through that. And the Within 3 folks were so helpful with that. But I noticed that I actually had to do some of it myself because I had that relationship already with those physicians. And just one more thing that I wanted to kind of tack on to Blake's point about the time that it takes. I think for the audience, that's a critical piece here. It does take your time and engagement to make these meetings successful. So one mistake or one lessons learned that I would have for my team is really that we need to dedicate somebody's time to doing these meetings. It's not, you can also do this in addition to your day job. It does take time to get quality meetings out. It's definitely worth it, but it's going to take a person's time to do. So I think that going in, if you're thinking about working within 3, you really need to kind of dedicate someone to doing that consistently.
So Blake, do you want to expand on that? What's your view have been both kinds in terms of how you're interacting with stakeholders, but what the reception has been with stakeholders that you're interacting with, and as you're doing, sounds like protocol development work.
Yeah, and as you know, Lance, we've been using your platform for a number of years for a number of different applications over time. And what Nisha just said was spot on. Is that if you're committing to an asynchronous approach, you really have to commit with the proper resources, because I mentioned before, the nurturing of that community is such an important piece of it, as well as getting the group comfortable with just a platform like that. I think that our industry has conditioned a lot of the key opinion leaders and the investigators for live meetings and interacting that way. And again, we look forward to the day of getting back to that as part of what we do. But I do agree with the other members of the panel that there will be a continuation of our current setting in some hybrid form going forward. And I think that with time, the folks that we interact with through these platforms have adjusted. Not everybody is on board, but there certainly has been a migration to accepting this approach. And importantly, for the viewers here, if you're not presently using a platform like Within3 or others, it's also a learning curve internally for the organization, thinking about compliance and some of these other aspects of things. So it's the external collaborators that pose one challenge and need to get them aligned and on board, but also your internal stakeholders, whether it's a resource matter, whether it's compliance, legal, those kinds of things, getting them comfortable with these kinds of platforms as being secure and being a tool, an essential tool, really, that will have to come into play over the course of time. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah. So Cornelius or what have you seen? What has the stakeholder reaction been to interacting with your company virtually versus in your traditional methods?
So
maybe I can go ahead on.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's quite mixed, right? You have particularly the younger generation that is very much into digital tools. Sometimes we have problems to get people accepting these tools. What is definitely a common topic, right, in this virtualization, and maybe also a bit of a challenge, is that most of our investigators or stakeholders suffer a bit from integration issues, right? We have around the clinical trial, we have a number of different software platforms in place. We have typically an IRT or randomization platform. We have a data entry platform. We have usually a platform for the logistics to order supplies for a trial, etc. And then, from a sponsor perspective, we also run usually a kind of management software to monitor a trial, see what's going on, where we are with our recruitment, etc. And all of that is fragmented, and sometimes it's very hard for, with this increasing virtualization, it's sometimes really hard for site staff to correctly work with all these different things. So I think one major challenge that I see is really to integrate better and more, and basically to come to one platform where you have everything inside, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's certainly a topic for our investigators.
What about you, how have your stakeholders responded to interacting with your company virtually?
So yes, definitely there are certain challenges which we cannot really overlook, because it's very, very important to have this sort of mixed match situation, like hybrid situation, because certain things at the study sites are not even possible to do virtually, which have to be like in certain things related to monitoring. No matter how much we do the virtual meetings and online and all that, it does not replace, for example, your disposing of drugs and drug accountability and the overall situation at the study sites. Those are aspects you cannot accomplish through virtual. Same thing goes to the KOL interaction and discussions. Yes, there are a lot of efficiencies in virtual system, but you lose that effectiveness when you go to a conference and you have your investigators, your KOLs, they are all under your contracts and all that. Then it's easy to grab them and discuss small things for 10 minutes or 5 minutes, which is very difficult because then you have to schedule here and to have that formal meeting. So those components are missing, and those are not insignificant components. Those are significant components in our day-to-day life and day-to-day achieving efficiency. So that is a sort of. But overall, I would say that still I think, given situation based on technology, this has done overall. They are not unhappy. Our stakeholders, means both study sites, investigators, or KOLs.
Okay, so let me go ahead. I'm going to put the results of the last poll on the screen so we can all see that. One moment. There we go. Yeah, so primarily the live webinar, right, is the number one way of doing virtual, and the asynchronous pieces are kind of coming on strong, certainly within medical affairs, but then now with COVID really kind of bleeding into within 3. How do you see that going forward? So, Blake, as you look at what you're doing beyond the pandemic, what do you think the mix of different types of interactions are going to be for your company?
Yeah, so I think that most in my company are eager to get back to some semblance of normal, and especially around conferences. That's a big part of what we do and what our company uses as a vehicle for our communications and interactions. But I think some of the extra face-to-face types of visits that encounter with travel and things like that will pull back, and the emergence of live webinars like we're doing now, as well as the asynchronous piece, will continue to grow. I really do like the way that we're planning a series right now around a steering committee. So using Nishi's an example where we have the plan for a bit of pre-work that will be part of the asynchronous piece. There will be the live webinar, and then there will be the post-work, part of the asynchronous piece. And, somewhere in the future, we might sprinkle in some sort of a face-to-face interaction into that as well. But I see that as very complementary to how to do insight generation or, developing documents or things like that, protocols and such that, versus just the going back fully to the live in-person types of approaches. I think that the world has woken up to this idea of these asynchronous pieces in particular as having a place in that overall continuum.
So let me kind of open it up to the panel. So where do you think we will be 5 years from now with these sorts of technologies? That's one of the questions that was submitted from the audience. I'm going to switch to those. And feel free, anyone can jump in. How do you see the future of communications in clinical work?
Yeah, 5 years seems a long time, but it actually is not, right? I must say, I started my first clinical trial it's almost 30 years ago. And at that time, there was already the first electronic data capturing systems were already being used, right? And it took another 20 years or so before it was fully accepted and validated. And so I think we live in a very conservative, around clinical trials, we live in a very conservative world. And on top of the conservative approach of our physicians, we also have very conservative authorities. And I think we're seeing that a bit, right? We see a lot of tools, and in theory, right? In theory, we could run a trial almost totally virtual. We hook up a patient with a sensor. We do mail order of the supplies. We might send a nurse to manage the patient. But this approach is still, at least in development, phase 2, phase 3, still very challenging because of a number of complexities that come with it. So my view is that in 5 years we'll see gradual adoption of these new technologies around trials to enhance how they are being managed, how they run. But it will be step by step. It will be not a total revolution. And, at the end of the day, it's still the effect, the medical effect and the medical monitoring of the new drug that will have to be seen on the patient over time. And that will always stay, right? That will never go away. So we can enhance a bit, but it will go, in my opinion, it will not be an immediate revolution. And I think in 5 years from now, we'll be kind of, where we are today with slightly more, hopefully more efficient conduct of trials.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So feel free to submit your questions to the Q&A button at the bottom. I'll go ahead and take the next one. So how does virtual engagement change the way teams recruit, review, and retain patients?
So I can speak to that a little bit because I've been working on a phase 3 study. I think what I found is just that kind of continual interaction that I was able to do on the Within 3 platform really helps keep folks engaged. So, we'll have an initial protocol training session, and then you guys know we'll have so many protocol amendments that come out, and it's really hard to train effectively. And so what I ended up using the Within 3 platform for was protocol amendment training and answering kind of one-off questions from individuals, and then all of the other people could see those answers in real time. So I think by keeping people engaged, it really did help. I was recruiting a trial that was like very biomarker specific, so difficult to find patients, but by keeping people engaged, and they knew that I was always going to answer, within a day, people were more engaged to be part of the trial. And we actually finished accrual earlier than anticipated despite COVID. So I really think that was a function of being continually engaged with the investigators and in their language a lot of the time, because this was a trial that was in 28 different countries. So.
Yeah, that's a great point and a great outcome. I mean, so, building on that, maybe Blake. So one of the things I think Nishi's talking about is in the traditional live meeting sort of headset, you have very specific, you have a meeting on this date sometime in the future, then a meeting on the next date sometime in the future. With the virtual technologies, you can interact more frequently, and that can have different, outcomes with speed. What are your thoughts on that, Blake, in terms of planning kind of traditional meeting around the Congress or whatever versus having platforms where the cost of convening people is so much lower and faster?
Well, there's clearly an advantage, for that last point, is that it's just it's a logistics advantage, for doing an online type of a meeting. And again, I think it's nice and it's very complementary to doing things live and in person. But to kind of build on what Nishi was just saying, one of the things that I've seen, the asynchronous portion in particular come into play is a sense of collaboration amongst the sites versus it always being the site to the sponsor, you start having site-to-site interactions, and they are problem solving on challenges with protocols and inclusion criteria, things like that, identifying patients and working to, maybe a patient that doesn't apparently qualify for the study, making some therapeutic adjustments to enable that to happen. So the site-to-site interaction, I think, is a piece that really is enhanced through a platform like Within3 versus, always coming back to the sponsor or the CRO for actions. And not necessarily in my present setting, but in past settings, we've seen the benefit of those kinds of interactions in a clinical trial setting.
So Cornelius, you've mentioned that in the work that you do, you really truly are dealing with a lot of different countries globally. As you think about the patient engagement side and the enrollment side, or just in general, kind of the frequency of communication with those sorts of stakeholders, what differences have you seen there?
Yeah, I think it's a controversial topic, actually. We also have to keep in mind that as a sponsor, there is always the interface, the direct interface to the patient is actually the local physician or the investigator, right? And we are in principle not so keen on communicating in a trial setting directly with the patient and bypassing the investigator. Sure. So it needs to be really in cooperation with the local investigator. But this being said, we do see that there are more tools to enhance that collaboration between the patient and the investigator, which allow also the sponsor to benefit from better compliance, a lower dropout rate, and also a higher recruitment if we manage to put together a kind of promotional campaign around the patient. But with all the hype, right, we around patient engagement and patient involvement, which is maybe very important in more niche orphan disease setting, but in general, there are a lot of repercussions also by law often or by GCP. And we are carefully maneuvering there and trying, of course, to enhance the patient experience, but always through the investigator and always in a cautious manner. But yeah, we do see some tools like patient handheld devices to score symptoms that are a great enhancement, reminders to patients through a smartphone, etc. So it adds to the experience for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, any thoughts on that? How do you think the move to virtual has impacted patients as it pertains to studies?
Yes, I think the virtual has biggest impact is on the patients, because virtual is good for us within the company, with the investigator, with the KOLs, but for the patients, for example, in the oncology area, patients have to come to site for drug administration, IV, every 3 weeks, for example, in one of the regimens. Now, they have those all limiting factors at the site. And unless, physically they come, they cannot get this. So they have limiting factor there. The other problem I have noticed in our trials is, let's say they have to go for MRI, they have to go for CT. Now, those facilities, they are open only for the emergency cases, or they are not taking our clinical trial patients for that, because it's a regular routine things. For even ECG, so we have to compromise whether they should go every 2 months versus every 2 weeks. And those are, so that has definitely impact on patients' lives and patients' care and patients' convenience. And people are not available for scheduling, their scheduling. Now they cannot delay. On the other hand, also patients, like they may have comorbidities and they are afraid to go to, let's say, cancer patients have cardiac issues. They will avoid that just in order to either minimize their efforts or to stay a little bit safe. So I think patients are the most affected people in current pandemic situation, which cannot be fully addressed by virtual systems, no matter what tools we use.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So switching gears to a different question. This one is around this term Zoom fatigue that people hear about, the theoretical exhaustion of being in front of the video camera hour after hour for meeting after meeting. How have you, on the real-time side of virtual engagement, or just in general, how have you tried to understand that, and has it changed your approach to doing virtual engagement? Maybe we can start with Nishi.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this goes back to just good meeting hygiene, right? Like if meetings are prepared properly, if people know what they're going to say, we don't have to have so many meetings and we don't have to have this Zoom fatigue. And to me, that's where Within 3 really came in, because, you know, Blake and I talked about this a little bit, but you have to kind of prepare and really know what you want, so you're not wasting a bunch of people's time by just putting them on a meeting and not really kind of getting to the meat right away. So I think that Within 3 is a good tool to kind of force the meeting organizer to combat Zoom fatigue by just having less live sessions like this.
Cornelius, what about you? How have you've mentioned investigator meetings and other things. How have you combated this fear of Zoom fatigue?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few, we clearly had a few learnings, right? It's definitely the behavior during a virtual meeting of the presenters should be a little bit different from a live meeting. I think, you know, in a flat format like a video format, you have to probably speak a bit slower and clearer and be more expressive relative to a live meeting. And we also learned to keep everything as simple, as short as possible, right? So I think as a rule of thumb, right, for a 1 hour live presentation, you would do a video presentation, a virtual presentation of maybe 40 minutes, right? We do see that the span of attention in front of a video or a computer screen is definitely less, because it's a much less dynamic setting compared to someone moving around on a stage or in a room. And the other thing we picked up also is that, and actually a very good thing to do is in these meetings to really very actively use the chat function, right? And it's actually great because in a live meeting, especially with a lot of people, you always have a few people that speak up and others are a bit more inhibited. The chat function I would absolutely recommend in these virtual settings is great. It allows everyone equal chances to jump in, to ask questions. So we use that, we learn to use that more and more and more active when we were running more of these virtual meetings. And it appeared to be really very beneficial for the overall meeting conduct and also for the overall, messaging and things that get communicated. So yeah, 3 things. I'd keep it short and simple. Prepare your presenters a little bit for the virtual setting and use the chat a lot. That's what we learned.
So Blake, I think you were mentioning sort of the same thing about the preparation for virtual engagement. Exactly kind of what Nishi and Cornelius were talking about is a bit more thoughtful going into it. What's your reaction, Ben, in terms of your participants in Zoom fatigue or maybe hesitancy to engage because of just being in yet another meeting, yet another platform, that sort of thing that we were talking about earlier? And how have you overcome it?
Yeah, so I love the phrase "good meeting hygiene," so I'm going to pick that one up. Thanks, Nishi. I think that it's the same thing that Cornelius just mentioned about being efficient, right, and being short and to the point, and in comparison to live in-person meetings where there's a lot more perhaps ad-libbing or things like that, some filler conversations. With the Zoom or the webinar, situations, get to the point, be efficient, and ideally, if you can, finish early. It's always a good feeling when you can finish early and somebody thinks they're getting even a few minutes back of their day, is a positive experience. And so plan for an early finish. And I think you tend to get buy-in for the next, for the next meeting and the next meeting from the audience that you're working with.
Well, great. Well, I think we are at time. This has been really a great conversation. I want to thank all the panelists for participating. Hopefully everyone on the call got a lot out of this. I think we hit a majority of the kind of categories of questions that were submitted. I'll turn it back over to Claudia to wrap us up.
Thank you so much. I think that has been a great discussion. I know that there has been a few answers that we couldn't go through today because, of course, we only have about an hour to cover with the panelists. But do not worry at all, because someone from the We Think Tree will be in touch with you in the next few days to cover those questions on answer. A kind reminder, we also have a survey. We would like to listen more from you. We want to tailor-make our next content. So please hit that survey and make sure that you answer all the questions that are provided to you. Once again, on behalf of We Think Tree, Marcus Evans' team, and the whole panel, I would like to thank you all for joining us today, and I hope that I'll be connecting very soon. So thank you so much, and have a great day, morning, and afternoon. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.